Welcome to the Escape into Board Games podcast.
I'm Chris.
And I'm Matt.
And this is our escape from the real world where we talk about board games. In this episode, we talk about board games for two.
So please join us for the Escape into Board Games podcast. Sometimes most of your board game group can't make it, or everyone has gone home early, or it's a quiet night in with you and your significant other, and you find yourself looking for games to play at two players.
But maybe you take advantage of this opportunity to get some games to the table that only play at two players.
Two-player games have been around since games themselves.
Go,
Checkers,
chess,
tic-tac-toe,
and Battleship.
The oldest games in the world are all two-player games.
Chess is 2,600 years old.
Go is 4,000 years old.
Checkers is 5,000 years old.
Backgammon is 5,000 years old.
And Mancala is 5,500 years old.
In this episode, we're at a table for two, with board games for two players. When you look at my board game collection, you'll find some heavy games over in one corner and some party games over here, and the games that are suitable for little kids will all be clumped together. Mm-hmm. Other than that, it's a Tetris thing, whatever fits where, but I do keep all my two-player games together. I just have them in one little section. Those ones are the only ones that play at two players.
Oh, that's cool. I'm fascinated already. When I'm buying games, I like to consider player count. I mean, obviously I buy games that I like, but I also think about, is this a game that I will get to play with, my primary gaming partner, my wife, Sherry? Is it one that she will enjoy?
Yeah.
And does it play at two, or does it play well at two? I play games with a lot of different people, but Sherry is with me on game days.
Sometimes I can only get one player to the table. So having those tight little two-player games in the collection really round it out.
Yeah. Sometimes a game that plays multiplayer is like 4 or 5 players. Sometimes it doesn't scale well with two players. Sometimes a game says, it plays 2 to 5 and you play it at 2 and it's kind of dull and and draggy. Yeah, that happens. You have
to have a dummy hand or...
Yeah. But most of the games that I'm presenting and some that you're going to talk about are probably on my favorite games to play, like in general, not just with two players.
Yeah.
They are really amazing, fun games. I like them a lot.
And it's interesting because these great games, you can't get to the table on a game night.
Yeah.
The situation needs to be that there's only you and one other player.
No, that's absolutely right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Lost Cities. Lost Cities is a Reiner Knizia design from 1999. It is a set collection, hand management, press your luck, abstracted treasure hunting game that plays in about 30 minutes and is recommended for ages 10 and up. Lost Cities is part of the famous Cosmos two-player series. In Lost Cities, players are archaeologists, competing at 5 different ancient sites scattered around the globe. Players are trying to complete archaeological expeditions to these cities, while also blocking their opponents from completing their treks.
In Lost Cities, are we archaeologists or...
The language in the game says explorers,
okay,
but we're exploring ruins, so I made a judgment call. And although there are times in this game when you feel like you're stuck in a dense jungle on the other side of the world with no chance of survival, there is no theme.
It's light on theme.
Very light, yeah. This is ultimately a card and numbers game.
Yeah.
Lost Cities is a deck of oversized cards. The cards are in 5 suits representing the 5 different cities that are in 5 different colors: yellow, green, blue, white, and red. Each suit contains exactly 12 cards, the numbers 2 through 10, and 3 investment cards.
Right.
The cards depict various stages of the expedition in 5 different locations. The Himalayan mountains in white, Central American rainforest in green, Egyptian desert in yellow, bottom of the sea in blue, and the mysterious volcano in red. Each suit will depict the journey with its cards so that the 2, 3, 4 will show the initial path and progress, where the 10 will have them arriving at the temple or the pyramid or whatever.
Right. This is one of the first games that I had played that had changing art on the cards.
Yeah.
Every card has sort of a different progression along this little path to the temple or pyramid.
Yeah.
And this is the first one that I remember that did that, because it's essentially just it's just a card game. There's a small deck of cards and this really thin board. It hardly even counts as a board game because it's just like this really thin piece of cardboard in the middle of the table.
And on that board are the 5 different locations for discarding. And that's what the board's for. You just put these piles of discards. In Lost Cities, each suit gets its own discard pile, and players collect and play cards on their side of the board, which represents the expeditions they are trying to complete. At the start of the game, both players start with 8 cards in their hand. On a player's turn, they play a card from their hand, either on their side of the board to represent an expedition they are trying to complete, or discarding a card into the appropriate discard pile. And then they complete their turn by drawing a card, so they have 8 cards in their hand. They can draw this card blind from the top of the deck, or they can draw from one of the 5 discard piles, which are all face up. When players play a card to an expedition, they play it in the appropriate colored row, and each card needs to be at a higher value than the previous card played.
So the 3 card can be played on top of the 2 card. Then you can play the 4 or the 5 or the 6, but you can't go back. So once you've played the 10, you can't play any more cards in that row.
Exactly. When players choose to go on an expedition, they are immediately 20 points in debt. Expeditions are expensive. Each card played on an expedition earns points, but even if you play the 2, 3, 5, and 10, you'd still be only breaking even. You need to be careful and selective about which expeditions you compete in.
Cards don't need to be in sequential order. They just need to be higher than the previously played card. Mm-hmm. So you could play the 2, the 3, skip the 4, and then play the 5. And the reason you might skip the 4 is because the 4 hasn't come out yet, or your opponent is also collecting expedition cards for that place.
Exactly. Or just holding them because they know you're trying to go on that expedition.
Right.
The hand limit is 8 cards, which you might think is a lot, but you have to hold on to the cards that you want to play later, the 8, the 9, the 10 of any color you're competing in. You need to hold on to the cards that could benefit your opponent.
Right.
If they're competing in yellow and they haven't laid any cards higher than the card in your hand, you need to keep them in your hand or your opponent will pick them up off the discard pile for some easy points.
Yeah.
This is what the game is. These are the choices that we're making. And it's tough.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it sounds like 8 cards is kind of a lot, but when you've got 5 different expeditions that you want to go to.
Oh, I never compete in 5, Chris. Good Lord.
No, but I mean, you've got 5 different expeditions.
Yeah.
And I'm holding 2 of them. The color is in my hand because I don't want you to get 8 points or 9 points.
Yeah.
Which in this game could be quite a bit.
That's the thing. You can start out with a hand of all 10s, 9s and 10s, and you go, wow, I got the best hand ever.
Yeah.
But you can't compete in all of those expeditions. And you certainly can't discard a 10 that your opponent's going to use. That's 10 points right in their hand. So you have to hold on to it. And then, your hand size gets so small, so fast.
And obviously, each game is different depending on how the cards come out for you and your opponents. That decides how the game will play. Every time you play, it's a little bit different.
That's so true. Yeah. So in the game, there's these investment cards. And if you want to play an investment card, you have to play it first before any other cards.
Right.
On the card is a picture of 2 gentlemen shaking hands. And this is, it kind of messes up the scoring now.
Yeah. Reiner Knizia is known for this sort of mathy, funny scoring, and Lost City works that well for that.
Exactly.
The investment cards can really boost your points, or they can really boost your negative points.
Exactly. They'll double the difference. If you hit 22 with an investment card, you get 4 points. And if you hit 18 on your expedition, you'll lose 4 points. So it doubles the difference, which is, right, like you said, Knizia's math.
Yeah.
He loves that stuff.
He's a mathematician, and a lot of his games have sort of these funky scoring that you need a calculator or that make you go, huh, that's neat. And Lost City is definitely one of those.
Yeah. And since those cards add so much risk to your expedition, right? Because if you don't make it, it's going to double your losses, and that's going to be horrible. And so I find those are the cards that we're always discarding, right? When we're trying to get that hand at the very beginning of the game,
right? More
often than not, I find the first few hands, you're discarding more than you're playing because you're not ready to commit to an expedition. You don't want to tell your opponent which expeditions you're going on. You need to rearrange the cards in your hand. You have to play a card.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing about this game, is that you play the card first and then you draw. You don't draw first and then play.
Right.
And so that's a little bit of a tricky thing to get your head around when you begin, because everybody's so used to the other way around. But it works really well, because now if you see a card in the discard pile that you want to pick up, you can't pick it up and then play it. You have to play something else first and then pick it up and then play it on your next turn.
And sometimes that discard action, you can use it against your opponent as sort of a lure. Like, here's another investment card to make you more points. Here's another one. Here's another one.
Pick them up. Go ahead. Pick them up.
You know what? You need to be invested in 3 or 4 of all of 5 of the expeditions, because that is, extending your risk and increasing the opportunity that you will lose points. So I'd like to,
for sure,
to tease opponents that way.
Yes. And the draw pile is really interesting, because picking up cards blind from the deck is the only way to get new cards into circulation. But as soon as the draw pile is empty, the round is over. Often, players will draw from the discard pile towards the end of the round to make the round last longer and give players a chance to get point cards out of their hand.
Yeah, sometimes you want the game to end real quick as your opponent is struggling, and sometimes you want it to end really as long as possible.
Right.
And it's kind of this fun thing, is sometimes both players are, play a card and then draw from the discard, because you want to extend the length of the game, and you're both trying to make it longer so that you can get these points out and grow your score.
Yeah.
But that can be tricky.
You're allowed to count the cards in the draw pile.
That's right.
Which I do almost every round, because you're like, okay, if there's 6 cards in the draw pile and my opponent draws one each round and I draw from the discard pile, I can get 5 cards out of my hand.
Right. Exactly. And I don't know if it's still the case, but certainly when I got into the hobby, a lot of people were saying, this is the best game to play with 2 players. If you're playing with your spouse, you should definitely play Lost Cities or get a copy of Lost Cities.
Yeah, that's how it was pitched to me, and it was as promised. Mm-hmm. It's always a hit when we play it.
It's a tiny box. Like, you can bring it with you in your suitcase or to the laundromat or wherever you're going, and you've got, 25 minutes to play a game.
It could still be smaller. It's just a deck of cards.
It could be. That's true. And the cards are quite large. It could still be smaller. You're right. Akrotiri. Akrotiri is a pick up and deliver tile placement game with a modular board. Akrotiri is a 2-player game that can be played in 45 minutes and is recommended for ages 13 and up. The game was designed by Jay Cormier and Sen-Fung Lim and was published in 2014 by Z-Man Games. Akrotiri has players exploring the islands around Thera and the Aegean Sea during the classical Greek times. Players are connecting trade routes, finding resources on the surrounding islands, and delivering them back to the island of Thera in order to fund the discovery and excavation of ancient Minoan temples. At the start of the game, players are given 2 gold cards with different ways to score additional points at the end of the game. Each player must keep 1 gold card and discard the other, but can get more during the game. Every turn, players add one tile to the board, building the islands and the routes through the islands that players can take.
Cool.
Each tile has some island segments, one of 4 different kinds of terrain icons: water, mountains, volcanoes, and trees, which also indicate which of the 4 different types of resources, blue, gray, red, and green, are available on that island.
Okay.
Resources that are placed on the islands are taken from the market board, and each resource that is removed from the board increases the price of that resource. After placing the tile and the resources on the board, the player will take actions. The number of actions a player may take is indicated on the bottom track of their player board. As you discover more temples, you will get to do more actions on your turn.
Cool.
Players can move their boat along the shipping routes indicated by lines on the tiles, or portage their boat across land, load a resource found on the island the player is docked at, excavate a temple, or buy new map cards that provide new opportunities to discover new temples.
Cool. I have not played Akrotiri, but I'm a huge fan of these tile-playing games. It reminds me of Carcassonne, but instead of building cities, you're building archipelagos.
Yeah.
And the little wooden boats you use in this game are fantastic. There's little carved out middle that allows you to fit 3 cubes to transport your goods. And of course, 3 is the limit, and they all fit in there just snug.
Yeah, and that's as many as you can carry on your turn.
Yeah, I like that.
When excavating a temple, the active player has to be able to play a map card from their hand, which can be legally played.
Okay.
And here's the thing. Each map card has a temple in the middle and will show a number of terrain icons either above, below, left, or right of that temple. So, for example, a player with a map card that has a volcano terrain showing above the temple and a tree terrain to the left of the temple would want to dock at an island that has a volcano terrain somewhere on the map on another tile somewhere north of that island's location, and a tree terrain icon on another tile somewhere to the west of its location. In order to demonstrate that this is the correct location for the temple.
That's cool.
So essentially, you're not discovering the temple, you're sort of laying tiles down in a way that make that island be where the temple is, if that makes sense.
Right. It's the Tobago mechanism, sort of a reverse deduction.
Exactly.
You're playing the cards that would fit the... Right. Okay.
Yeah. And what's really cool about it is, so we sit across from each other when we're playing this game. So the icons that are to the north for me are actually to the south for you.
Oh, cool.
And, you know, I don't know what's on the map cards that you have.
Right.
So I can't plan to block you or anything like that. But, you know, what's on my left is on your right, and what's on my south is your north, kind of thing. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Each temple excavation will score you victory points at the end of the game and unlock more actions that you can take on your turn. There are 3 different types of map cards that you can choose to take: easy, medium, hard, and they will provide you with 1, 3, or 7 victory points. However, excavating a temple also costs money, so you have to have the coins printed on the card in order to excavate the temple to begin with.
Okay.
The more points you get for the temple, the harder it will be to accomplish, because it will have more icons on the map and require more money to excavate.
Yeah, okay.
Money is tight in this game. Players can get more money by returning to the start island of Thera to deliver goods that they've collected. So you're picking up these cubes, you bring them to the island of Thera, and you exchange them for the prices printed on the market board. Remember, by taking the cubes off the market board, you made the prices of those goods more expensive. So as goods are returned to the market board, the prices for those goods decrease.
Oh, of course. Interesting. Wow. Yeah.
A game of Akrotiri ends at the end of the round when one player has discovered their 6th temple. Points are awarded for each successfully played map card and how well you met the scoring conditions of each gold card that was secret in your hand. Players also get 1 point for each 10 coins they have at the end of the game. The player with the most points wins.
Okay.
Akrotiri is co-designed by 2 fellow Canadians, Sen Fung Lim and Jay Cormier. Although we have the same last name, there's no relation. It's a very small box game, but provides a lot of strategy inside. It's very thinky. It's got some interesting decisions. It's this sort of mix of several different mechanisms that we've seen in other games. It's really, really good. I like it a lot. Every time you play, the map will develop in a very different way. And that makes it, the replayability quite a bit. The gold cards that come up with it, there's a lot of them. So that makes replayability quite good. Like Carcassonne, when the game is over and all the tiles are out covering so much of this table, it's quite beautiful to look at. It's all water and, these islands. It's quite beautiful. The art and the components are really quite perfect.
Cool.
In Akrotiri, it's hard to defend against where your opponents are placing their temples, because you don't know what pattern of terrain icons they have on their cards. Mm-hmm. But even with that, it still doesn't feel like this sort of multiplayer solitaire game, because players are still able to drive the prices of resources up or down, depending on how many of each are in the game.
Nice.
And you can see your opponent, if they have 3 of one color of cube, you might want to get as many of those cubes back to the island of Thera to bring the price down on them so that they can't fulfill the more expensive map cards.
Huh. A multiplayer solitaire game is a game that requires little to no player interaction, and players are basically just doing their own thing in the game to score points, without being able to affect their opponents.
We liked Akrotiri so much, we actually bought 2 copies of the game.
Oh, nice.
And I painted the boats and the temples of the second copy so we could combine them to play with up to 4 players.
That kind of goes against the spirit of this episode, though, doesn't it, Chris? Fugitive. Fugitive is a secret agents and spies, hidden movement, bluffing, deduction card game for 2 players, designed by Tim Fowers and with art by Ryan Goldsberry. Fugitive plays in about 20 minutes and was published by Fowers Games in 2017. In Fugitive, 1 player plays the marshal in hot pursuit, and 1 player plays the fugitive trying to evade capture. The game consists mostly of a deck of 42 cards numbered 1 through 42, each with a unique picture. The pictures tell a story. It's a progression like panels of a comic book. 1 panel on the card will have the fugitive making a bold escape, while the next card, the marshal, will be catching a break and making some headway in their pursuit. The first few cards, the 1, 2, 3, tell the story of the beginning of the chase, and the 40, 41, and 42 depict the fugitive's escape.
They're kind of like the cards in Lost Cities, right? I mean, in the sense that the art is different on each card?
Yeah. But it even tells the story even more so. Like in one picture, the fugitive is ducking into a club. And then the next card sequentially, the agent sees him going in there and pursues him into the club. And then the following card, the fugitive is speaking to the DJ. And then he's ducking out the back. And then a couple of cards later, the DJ is turning on the smoke machine, which allows the fugitive to get away.
Cool. Yeah, I like that. The art is very neat in this game.
Yeah, Ryan Goldsberry's done a great job. He does the art for Getaway Driver, Burgle Brothers, and a few other Fowers games. The object of the game is for the fugitive player to escape by playing the 42 card. The marshal needs to stop them. On the fugitive's turn, they will play a card from their hand face down, next to the last card they played. This card needs to be within 3 of the previous card. So if the last card the fugitive plays was a 10, then the fugitive must play an 11, 12, or 13 next to it.
That answers the question. Can't I just play my 42 card, the first card, and win the game and it's over? No, it has to be within 3. So you have to play several cards before you can get to that 42.
Yeah. These cards represent the hideouts that the fugitive uses in their path of escape. The marshal needs to correctly guess these cards. Each player starts with a certain number of cards. On their turn, the fugitive player draws a card and plays a card. The marshal draws a card and then guesses any number of cards on the table. If the fugitive player can't play a card within 3, they can add steps to get them to the next card. Each card in the deck has steps on the top right-hand corner. Odd cards have 1 step, and even cards have 2 steps. Adding these steps to get you to the next hideout can be a lifesaver, but if and when the marshal guesses that hideout, they get to see that card and all the steps you use to get there. This can be a tremendous amount of information if the fugitive used a lot of step cards. The cards are organized in 3 piles, the beginning, the middle, and the end. So if you draw from the first pile, you're going to get cards 14 and under. The middle deck is 15 through 28, and the last deck is 29 and up. This is really clever for a number of reasons. It breaks up the chase into manageable stages.
Right.
If the marshal sees a fugitive player drawing from the middle of the deck, they know that they're almost halfway through. They need to get some higher cards. It's a great way the game forces the fugitive to give up some information. Alternatively, the fugitive player can use this as a bluffing mechanism. Maybe the fugitive player plays a few hideouts and starts drawing from the middle deck. The marshal's going to think that they're in the teens somewhere, but that doesn't necessarily need to be the case.
Right. And it buys you some time as the...
Right? Yeah, there's so many ways you can play this as the fugitive player.
Mm-hmm.
The fugitive player doesn't need to play a hideout on their turn. If the cards aren't right, or if they've got a bit of a lead on the marshal player, they can stay put, keeping more cards in their hand for future turns.
And that's because the fugitive can play more than one card on their turn.
Right, with those step cards in order to bridge those gaps. Exactly. And so your hand size is going to kind of shrink and grow as the game goes on. And you can paint yourself into a corner if you get to a point where you have very few cards in your hand and the cards aren't 3 away from where you currently are.
Right.
It's a tricky balancing act.
Yeah.
The marshal player is also drawing cards each turn. This allows them to eliminate potential hideouts. The marshal player can draw from any deck. The usual strategy is to draw from the same deck as the fugitive. The more cards the marshal has, the better their guesses will be when locating hideouts. But the marshal player could spend draws pulling cards from future decks. This is called setting up a roadblock. The idea is that once the fugitive player makes it to a certain stretch of cards, the marshal player already has them in their hand.
Right.
Forcing the fugitive player to waste turns building up enough steps to bridge the gap.
Yeah, and that works so thematically, obviously, with the game. Like, I just love the idea, it's just setting up a roadblock for the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, it works.
Yeah, and that's what's so interesting about this game is that it is just a deck of cards with numbers on it, but it feels like a chase.
It really does.
You feel like you're hunting this player down there. They're hiding in these locations. And where was he last? Number 4 was played. Well, if number 4 was played, then they have to be at 5, 6, or this has to be 5, 6, or 7. And you're like, oh, it's such.
Yeah.
But when you're the fugitive player, you feel like you're being chased. You're like, you have to get away from the marshal as quickly as possible. And you're hiding and you're just hoping that they don't guess where you are.
Yeah, it's a considerable amount of tension too. I mean, on both sides.
Yeah.
Like you are really feeling as a fugitive. I think I've only played as the fugitive. As a fugitive, you just feel like you're being chased and there's so much tension about what you can do and how fast you have to go and think ahead. It's quite good. I'm always impressed with how well it plays out thematically.
Yeah. When you see it play out, you would think that the fugitive player has this huge advantage over the marshal in that they have all these options for hideouts. At the start of the game, they put 2 hideouts down. So the 0 card is already on the table.
Right.
And the first card has to be a 1, 2, or 3 if there's no added steps. And then the second card could be a 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. So the first 2 hideouts could be a 3 and a 6, or they could be a 1 and a 2.
Yeah.
The marshal player has no information at the start of the game to determine the hideouts.
Yeah.
But quickly, as the marshal is drawing more cards on each turn, they can eliminate certain possibilities. And then there's this point in the game where the marshal ends up getting the advantage. And then the fugitive player really has to, work hard. The 42 cards is a long stretch and it takes a while. And there's this ebb and flow that happens.
Yeah.
And the fugitive gets away, but then the marshal player will catch up.
Yeah.
And it's like you said, there's an immense amount of tension. It's just wonderful.
Like for a game that is kind of mathy, like it's all just there's not math, I guess, but it's all numbers, right?
Exactly.
It still hits the key notes thematically and has this sort of story arc that, follows this kind of movie or story that we've read about a police chase. It works well.
Yeah. The fugitive player can place step cards on a hideout, but not use them. I mean, they can bluff the marshal, right? Like you could put down, your first two hideouts could be the 1 and the 2, but you could have added a step card to that second one.
Right.
And so now it looks as though, so if there's a step card on the second one, this could be a 3 and a 7 or an 8, right? But really it's 2, right? And so the marshal's looking at 7, 8, 9, like in this area, and you're laying down 1, 2, and 3. That's one of my favorite bluffing techniques. Right off the bat, you stay really, really close to 0. The first card is a 1, the second card is a 2, the third card is a 3, fourth card is a 4, right? And they're guessing, is this a 5? And you're like, nope. Right off the bat, if you get the marshal player frustrated, you can use that as an advantage. You get a little bit further ahead and just eke a little bit of a head start out, and then hopefully you can get away.
The Fugitive could easily have been included in our thematic episode.
Oh, exactly. Or our deduction episode.
Right.
Because it's fantastic in both of those areas.
It very much is.
No, we had to include it in our 2-player episode because it's such a great 2-player game.
Yeah, it's an excellent game. Targi. Designed by Andreas Steiger and published in 2012 by Cosmos, Targi is a 2-player worker placement game for ages 12 and up that can be played in less than an hour. Leaders of the nomadic Tuareg tribes in the Saharan desert are trading goods, dates, salt, and pepper in order to obtain gold and other benefits. In Targi, the board is made up entirely of cards in a 5x5 grid. The cards that border the outside edges of the grid are action cards that let players collect goods or do things like exchange some resources for gold or other different resources. The cards in the middle of the grid contain tribal cards as well as some other cards to help collect goods. But tribal cards provide an ongoing benefit in-game and victory points at the end of the game. The game is predominantly scored and won by playing those tribal cards to your personal display area in front of each player. Players are encouraged to collect tribal cards and add them to their display in a couple of different ways. Each player's display can consist of 3 rows of 4 cards each, filled from left to right, and cards cannot be moved once played. At the end of the game, players will score 4 points for a full row of 4 identical card types and 2 points for a full row of 4 distinct card types.
Personally, I always go for the 2 points, the full row of 4 distinct cards. I think that's the easier of the 2 strategies. I find it really difficult to get 4 identical in a row, so I'm always doing...
That's a pretty good strategy, actually. I think you're right. I think it is very hard to get 4 of them.
But similar to the other games that we've talked about in this episode, the way, the order the cards come out will dictate the strategy for that game.
Yeah, very true. The meat of the game is in taking turns, placing your 3 Targi meeples one at a time on the cards that make up the outer border. Workers are placed one at a time, not on corners, and not on a card where there is already another meeple. Once all the Targi meeple are placed, players then execute the actions on the border cards where their meeple are, and also take the cards from the middle where your meeple intersect. The game provides each player 2 tribe markers to place on each card that intersects with 2 of their Targi meeple.
So this is not unlike the battleship mechanism.
Okay.
A4. And you go down the column. I'm coming down the column here, and I'm coming across the row here, and where that intersects, well, that's where I place my marker, and that's the thing that I get, my little bonus. So not only are you getting the bonus around the outside or where you place your Targi, you're getting the bonus of where the 2 Targis intersect. Right.
That is an excellent way to describe it. I never thought of it as sort of comparing it to Battleship. I've always used the XY axis, but everyone understands the Battleship explanation. That's good. Usually tribal cards are played or discarded immediately once they're drawn. A single card can be kept in hand, but then requires a special action to play it later in the game. Each card has a cost of goods to play, and goods are obtained either from the cards on the border spaces or from a deck of goods cards. As cards in the middle are removed, they are replaced, and as such, what's available for you changes partially every round, making the game dynamic. Every turn, the robber meeple moves from card to card, around the edge of the border cards, taking up an available action that players can't use that turn, and when the robber gets to one of the corner spaces, he conducts a raid and takes goods, gold, or victory points from both players. The game ends when one player fills their personal display with either their 12th tribal card or when the robber completes a trip all the way around the outside border cards and performs his 4th raid against the players. The winner is the player with the most victory points. Targi is a small box game that forces big decisions from its players. It's a very tightly focused and well-balanced 2-player game with a lot of depth.
Agreed. It's elegant in that mechanism, the XY mechanism where you're putting the things and you can block your opponent, right? All that is just such meaty decisions, but it's not a heavy game, not difficult to learn. You can pick it up really quickly.
Yeah, and it's not a game that's bogged down with like a lot of rules and explanations, and you got to look this up if this happens, and there's surprisingly few components, but it still manages to create this really engaging and rewarding experience.
Yeah, I was going to correct you on the components, but you're right. There's just a few tokens and some cards.
Yeah, there's I guess a few different decks of cards, but there's not a terrible amount of cards. Like it's not a lot of cards.
Yeah.
We've seen the tableau building and resource management elements of Targi in lots of other games before, but that worker placement mechanism, it feels very fresh, I think, because of that sort of XY axis thing.
Yeah, it's surprising that that's not included in more designs.
Yeah, it really could be. I don't see why not. Players, when they're playing, they have to focus on not just where they're placing their workers and where their opponents are going, but also on how those placements will intersect on that XY axis with the cards that are in the middle of the board. Targi demands both linear and spatial strategic planning.
Yeah, and because it's that 2-player back and forth, it's very easy to keep track of what your opponent needs to complete certain objectives. And you can block that one gold piece that's on the board by placing your Targi on that row or on that column, right? If you want, I want the dates from that column. I don't want the gold from that column, but I can block the gold by placing my Targi in that same column and then pick something else from the row.
Yeah, it's so clever the way they've put it together. There is an additional element of engine building, as your tribal cards can provide additional benefits in-game that you can use to your advantage with the right combination of cards.
Yeah.
I had to look up the name to find out why it's called Targi. The game is named after the Tuareg people, who seem to be named after a region of Libya more commonly known as Fezzan.
Huh.
Mm-hmm.
You can play Targi online using a free account on BoardGameArena.com. That Time You Killed Me. That Time You Killed Me is a grid movement, multiple maps, time travel abstract strategy game for 2 players, designed by Peter C. Hayward. That Time You Killed Me plays in about 15 to 30 minutes and was published by Pandasaurus Games in 2021. It is the far-flung future, and you are the inventor of time travel. But before you can be the master of all time and space, you must first defeat your rival, who also claims to be the inventor of time travel. Honestly, it's a bit of a gray area. Time travel is weird that way. That Time You Killed Me is played over 3 separate 4x4 checkerboards. Each board represents a different location in time: the past, the present, and the future. Players begin the game with a pawn in the opposite corner of each board, or era, and a few extra pawns in their supply. On their turn, they can take 2 actions. The game includes a few modular expansions, but the actions available in your first game are moving orthogonally in any direction or traveling in time. After the player has moved their pawn, they need to change focus. If they started their turn in the past, then they need to move their focus indicator into either the present or the future, so that the next turn, the player will activate a pawn in that chosen era.
Cool. I've not played this game. I'm excited to give it a try because I love the idea of time travel and that sort of thing. And in a game, I think that can be really interesting.
Yeah. You're trying to eliminate your opponent's pawns by pushing them into walls or into each other. This grid movement feels a lot like chess or checkers. You want your pawns close enough to be a threat, but not so close that they're vulnerable. But the added time travel mechanism literally adds another dimension to the game. It's not a colorful name for a simple movement mechanism. It really feels like 4D checkers. When you lose a pawn to your opponent, it feels painfully obvious in retrospect. You feel silly for missing such a blatant vulnerability. But it's because our brains aren't used to thinking with that extra dimension of movement.
Right. Shouldn't it be 3D checkers, not 4D checkers? What's the 4th D?
The 4th dimension is time.
Time, right.
3D is our dimension. Okay. And that's why it feels like it's 4D, because the game is already 3D. We're not going up, of course, but it's out there on the table. It's like tactile. It really feels like the 4th dimension we're dealing with is time. Because there's different things that'll happen. The modular components that you open up in later games will affect different eras.
Oh, okay.
And I don't want to spoil it, but they are things that you do in one board, which will then affect the other board. And there's a few different expansions in there, and they each do that differently.
Cool.
And which really changes the game. Even just having one expansion in the game changes it, but you can then do multiple expansions, and it really messes with that 4th dimension, that time dimension. I'm reminded of the space battle between Kirk and Khan in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, when they're in the nebula and they can't see each other.
Right.
And Khan is working in a 2-dimensional plane. He's working with the X and the Y. He's right in their battle. But Kirk is like, he's a spacefaring man, and he's used to this 3rd dimension. He goes up and loses Khan in the nebula, and then comes down for a surprise attack. And that's what it feels like. There's this other dimension that you're not used to using.
That's cool.
That Time You Killed Me is technically an abstract strategy game. That's where it falls in the category. And I always thought that meant it was themeless. The opposite of themed game is an abstract game. But I was incorrect in my thinking. This is definitely the most thematic abstract strategy game I can think of.
Yeah, it's not something we normally associate it with. The idea of an abstract game is that it might be a thematic game or have theme on it other than just sort of tacked on or taped on, so that, there's a bit of a story to tell with your abstract game.
This game could have easily have been included in our thematic games episode.
Wow.
Because it really feels like you're manipulating that time. I have a few games with the time travel theme. I'm a fan.
Cool. And
this is by far the one that feels like you're manipulating time, like you're actually a time traveler.
Cool.
It's not alone. It's not a let's redo the last trick played. It really feels like it's another dimension that you're playing in.
Very cool. We are going to have to play this. This sounds really interesting.
When you time travel, your pawn goes to the next board.
In the same location, right?
Right. Each of the locations are numbered, and so if you're leaving from spot 15, then you'll go to spot 15, which is in the same location in the other board. And that's how it works if you travel through time. But if you go backwards in time, then your pawn will stay in that location where you are right now, and you'll take another pawn from your supply and put it in the earlier era.
Cool.
Because like in time travel, if you do go back in time, you were still in the present before you left.
Right.
And so in this way, you're depleting your resources. and forcing the conflict to move to the future. Because after you've lost all your pawns, you cannot travel back in time. You can only travel forwards in time.
Cool.
And it acts like a really interesting tightening. There's an elegance to this game, as there are so few rules, and it's easy to grasp. But then again, it's hard to master.
Okay.
Because there's so many decisions that you can make on a turn, there is quite a lot of analysis paralysis. And so a typical game of this will be a lot of quiet contemplation with staring at the board and asking, is it my turn? Wait, whose turn is it?
Right.
Because there'll just be huge swaths of silence as we just try to puzzle out this very complex strategy. It is way overproduced. Each of the pawns is a cool little statue, and the boards and everything are nice and thick. They didn't have to make it a modular components and have that advent calendar aspect, but each of the different components are in an individual box, and the art and graphic design on it are really solid.
Awesome. I'm adding this to our list of games we have to play together because I want to try this.
We're going to get back to the show after a brief message. This next ad is for Chris's own company, Geeky Goodies. If you'd like to hear what an ad for your game, product, or website might sound like, drop us a line at escapeintoboardgames@gmail.com. When we escape into board games, we're always wearing our Geeky Goodies t-shirts.
They are great conversation starters for gamers and non-gamers.
But did you know that they also sell masks, socks, hoodies, game room posters, mugs, and so much more?
All things board games.
All things geeky.
Visit geekygoodies.com and use coupon code ESCAPE for a 10% discount off your purchase. Patchwork. Patchwork is a tile placement puzzle game for 2 players ages 8 and up. Designed by Uwe Rosenberg, Patchwork can be played in 20 to 30 minutes, and it was published in 2015 by Lookout Games. Patchwork is a largely abstract game with an actual theme. Players are competing to build the most aesthetic and high-scoring patchwork quilt on a personal game board made up of a 9x9 grid of squares. To start, players lay out all the cardboard patches in various different shapes in a large random circle with a spool marker placed somewhere in the circle between 2 pieces. Each player gets a few buttons at the start of the game to be used as currency during the game and as points at the end of the game. All the patches have a cost in buttons that it can be purchased for, and a cost in time that it takes to sew the patch onto your quilt. And all the patches come in different polyomino shapes.
A polyomino is a name given to a shape created by using a group of equal-sized squares that touch at their edges. 2 domino pieces in the shape of an L would be an example of a polyomino shape, as are the squares in the game of Tetris. That's what's interesting, is that sometimes the shape is quite big, which will help you fill up your quilt. But because it's an odd shape, it'll be cheap.
Yeah.
The different cost. Yeah, it's really interesting that those different pieces having the 2 different currencies.
Yeah. And this is a time mechanic, right? A time track is essentially what it is.
What's your favorite mechanism?
It is my favorite board game mechanism. So if you buy a quilt that costs very little, usually it has a big expense of time. So it costs you 5 or 6 spaces on the time board. And once you get to the end, the game is over for you. Many of the pieces in the game also feature a number of buttons that show how much players will earn in buttons during several times during the game. On your turn, players either purchase one of the 3 patches closest to the marker in a clockwise direction, or they pass. Patches are paid for with buttons, and the marker moves to its new location where the purchase patch was in the circle. Purchased patches must be added to your game board, and your player marker is advanced on the time track a number of spaces equal to the amount of time shown on the patch. Of course, patches cannot overlap other patches or hang off your personal board. If you can't afford any of the available pieces, or you choose not to buy a patch, you must advance your player marker ahead on the time track until your piece is immediately ahead of the next closest player. Players gain 1 button income for each space of the track that you advance. A few spots on the time track have a 1x1 leather square patch on them, and whoever's player marker passes these spots first collect the tiny patch and place them on their player board.
Those little leather patches are invaluable because they'll fit in all those little spots that you weren't able to fill. But simple 1x1 is just so powerful. You just patch up all the little holes. Love those.
You never have enough of them, I find, because you're putting together this puzzle with all these different odd shapes, and there's always 1 or 2 little spots that you wish
you couldn't get.
I need to fill that in. I need to fill this in.
Exactly.
Patchwork ends when all players reach the end of the time track, and points are awarded for each button in your collection at the end of the game. Players also lose 2 points for each empty square in the 9x9 grid of their player boards, and the player with the most points wins.
Our first few games, we did not break even. We were always in the negatives.
Yeah, it's one of those games, I like to tell people, it's one of those games where you can win with a score of like -12.
Yeah.
It's still higher than your -22 or whatever. But yeah, you can definitely win with a negative score. So personally, I found that people who like the old video game Tetris, oh boy, I'm showing my age. People who like Tetris tend to really enjoy Patchwork. It's that sort of puzzle of making everything fit together as efficiently as possible using the available pieces that come up on your turn. It's more about the tactical decisions you have to make during the game rather than that strategic planning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that about it.
Thematically, Patchwork is very, very approachable. It's one that, as soon as you explain it, everyone instantly understands. Oh, we're making a quilt and these are our quilts and they have to all fit together.
Yeah.
The rules are easy to learn so that it's not going to turn off some new gamers or gamers that aren't, super thrilled or enamored with the theme of sewing quilts. It doesn't take very long to play. And it has an interesting game arch. In the early game, players are struggling to manage the number of buttons that they earn. You want to buy patches to go in your quilt that have a lot of buttons on them so that when you do get paid, you get paid in buttons.
Yeah.
But then later in the game, you tend to have more money and it becomes more about managing the time that you want to spend for each piece and, the available space that it takes up on the board.
Yeah.
It really is an interesting arc that way. We've played Patchwork a lot. It's one that I never really get tired of playing. And like Akrotiri in this episode, we like the game so much that we bought 2 copies of the game so that we could combine them to play with up to 4 players. In that version, we use both sets of patches, making a very, very large circle of pieces, twice as many leather patches, and both markers placed at different places in the circle, giving players the options to buy 1 of the 3 pieces in front of either spool marker. And the game works perfectly, flawlessly with 3 and 4 players.
Interesting.
Yeah, well worth it. That's Patchwork.
Jaipur. Jaipur is a drafting, set collection, hand management, economic card game for 2 players. Originally published by GameWorks in 2009, Jaipur was designed by Sebastian Pochon. In Jaipur, players are competing merchants, trading and selling in spices, silk, leather, silver, diamonds, and gold. The game consists of a deck of cards and some scoring tokens. There's 5 to 9 tokens for each of the 6 different goods we're trading in, plus some bonus point tokens and some tokens for keeping track of rounds. The deck is just the goods and some camels.
The cards, the goods themselves, they're not numbered. It's just, they are a deck of leather, a deck of silk or spices or gold.
Exactly. It's just a picture of diamonds or whatever.
Yeah. It's not like this camel card is better than that camel card or this silk is better than that silk.
Exactly. To set up a game, you make piles of these good tokens, deal out 5 cards to each player, and set up the market, which is a line of 5 cards that sit between the players. Any camel cards in a player's hand, or acquired later, are placed in a pile in front of them. They do not count towards the 7-card hand limit.
I always thought that was a neat mechanism. It's one you don't see in other games, really.
Yeah.
Like, all these cards are your hand limit, and you've got a discard if you get more. That's a pretty common thing.
Yeah.
But like, this is the only game that I can think of that it's like, when you get this card, it goes in front of you and it doesn't count.
Unlimited camels. Yeah, you have a big stack of them, and you do not need to tell your opponent how many you have during the game. It can be secret.
Right.
On a player's turn, they can either get cards or sell cards.
Pretty simple.
It's the simplest game. Getting cards comes in 3 different flavors. You can just take 1 card from the market and add it to your hand. You can exchange any number of goods in the market for camels and or goods from your hand, or you can take all the camels in the market.
So the camels are currency.
Exactly. Selling goods is how we get points. On a player's turn, they can discard cards of a single good type from their hand and collect 1 token from the matching token pile for each card discarded this way. They would also collect a bonus tile if they sold more than 3 goods at one time. If they sold 3, 4, or 5 goods in a single turn, they would draw bonus tiles from the 3, 4, or 5 token pile. Each of the tokens are stacked in descending order, so the first leather token will be worth 4 points, the second 3 points, then 2 points, and then the last 4 tokens are only worth 1 point each.
So you're racing to sell your goods as quickly as you can to get the higher point value tokens.
Exactly. Each of the goods are worth a varying amount of money too. While leather is pretty cheap, but there's lots of it, the gold, silver, and diamonds can be worth up to 7 points for a single token. So while you're playing the game, there's a few things to keep in mind. You want to be the first to make a sale in each of the different goods, as the tokens on top are worth more. You want to deal in silver, gold, and diamonds as often as you can, because they're worth the most points. And you want to sell as many tokens at once so that you can get the higher bonus tokens. And once again, like we've seen in other games in this episode, your limited hand size is what's going to make these decisions so difficult.
So the camels play a big part in this game, and it's important to sort of keep them from your opponent and, sort of watch how many that your opponent is taking and how many you have.
You see the silver and the gold come out into the market, and you want to put those in your hand. And the easiest way to do that is to take camels that are in front of you and put them in the market and take all those high point cards and put them in your hand. But now the market is flooded with camels, and your opponent's going to take those.
Yeah.
And you're not going to have any camels to collect. But then again, you're not going to have the room in your hand for those any more cards either.
Yeah.
And so there's this ebb and flow and this back and forth, and it's always good. I'm trying to get rid of the cards from my hand so that I can acquire more cards, but at the same time I want to hold as many as I can so I can get those big bonuses. If I sell 5 at a time, I can get 10 extra points.
Right.
The bonus tiles for 5 trade is 8, 9, or 10 points. So that's a lot of points.
Yeah.
But it's really difficult to fill your hand with 5 of the same good.
Right.
When 2 token piles have been depleted or the market deck runs out, the round is over and players total up their scores. The winner of the round gets a Seal of Excellence token, and then we play again. The first player to win 2 Seals of Excellence wins the game.
It's basically the best 2 out of 3. It's basically what you're doing.
Exactly,
there.
Yeah. I played a lot of this with kids. This is a really great family weight game. The kids can get into it pretty easily, and there's enough going on that there's a nice meaty strategy for the adults, but there's not a huge disparity between grown-up and young person.
Yeah, and it's a good date night game because you can sort of chit-chat and goof around and, talk while you're playing. It's not terribly mean. It's not extremely taxing on your brain, and you got to figure this out. Well, just give me a minute while I think about my turn. It's not that at all. It's a fun light game.
For sure. There's not a lot of, bad feelings because you took that, or I was going to go in for the big points and you took them away. There's a little bit of that, but it's not
much.
Not much.
Not much, unless you're playing with my wife, Sherry. So there's a reprint of this game.
There is. Space Cowboys did print it after GameWorks did, but I don't think they made any improvements, really. Vincent Toutre did the art, and I normally love Vincent Toutre's art, but I didn't find it any more or less appealing than the original art. I would have liked to have seen maybe acrylic tiles or like poker chips instead of the cardboard chips. That would have been a nice improvement.
Yeah, that would be good.
The Space Cowboys version came with a metal coin for some reason, and I'm not sure what that was used for.
Yeah, I had it explained to me because I looked at it and it said, metal coin or something included. And I was like, oh my God, they've replaced all the tokens with these awesome little coins. And he was like, no, it's just one.
It's just one.
It's just one. It's like the current player token, or I don't know what it is. It could even be a flip. I don't remember. It wasn't memorable enough for me to go, oh yeah, I got to check that out.
Yeah, I already owned the original version. I wasn't going to replace it, certainly.
Same with me.
If I hadn't owned either version, I may be seeking out the original.
Perhaps. Like
Castles of Burgundy and Camel Up. And it is added to a short list of unnecessary and unimproved reprints.
Oh, hot take. Hot take. Star Wars, The Queen's Gambit. Star Wars The Queen's Gambit is a dice and card game with miniatures about the movie Star Wars The Phantom Menace. While the game box says 2 to 4 players, it's really a 2-player game for ages 12 and up. Star Wars The Queen's Gambit takes about 2 hours to play, was designed by Rob Davio, Alan Roach, and Craig Van Ness, and was published in 2000 by Avalon Hill Games and Hasbro.
Is it unfair for us to present a game that is completely unattainable to the public, and they would have to spend hundreds of dollars on eBay in order to experience it?
I don't think so.
Okay.
In Star Wars The Queen's Gambit, players face off against each other, playing as either the Naboo forces or the forces of the Trade Federation, as they recreate the 4 battles at the end of Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace.
When you presented this game to me, it was already set up, and I walked in and there's this tower on the table and there's all these miniatures and it looks like a storyboard for the final 40 minutes of the movie. And you're like, here, have a seat here. And I could not get over the scale of.
It's a big game. Yeah.
Because like you said, it is 4 different battles going on. And so help me out. On my left is the Naboo field with
the Gungan forces.
Yeah. There's more than one different kind of miniature there. We're dealing with they
have like a catapult that they shoot across, and then they have like a horsed unit that can travel. It looks like it's on a horse or something some sort of cavalry unit. And they're fighting against the droids, and the droids have these sort of tanks that shoot missiles and battle droids that'll come out, the little black roll ones that roll through the movies. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So that's one of the boards in the game. Yeah. And that battle is happening in this game.
I love that.
The other side features a space battle where Anakin is in his starfight.
Yeah.
And he is in his little spaceship, and he is trying to get through to the droid control ship and destroy it.
Right.
And then on that board as well is the fight between the 2 Jedis.
And Darth Maul.
Yeah, that's Darth Maul and Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Nice.
That board is sort of divided up into 2. So 2 battles are happening on that board. 2 different battles are happening.
Yeah.
And then the final piece of this game, which I think is probably the most visually impressive part.
Agreed.
Is the 3-floor tower. So it's literally a 3D tower in the middle of this board.
And that's Queen Amidala's palace.
Yeah, it's the palace. That's the Naboo forces led by Queen Amidala. They are trying to retake Theed Palace and get to the top.
Yeah.
and fight their way through the droids, the battle droids, and that kind of thing.
And it's just a sea of droids, if I'm remembering correctly. Like, there is just so many of those little...
Yeah, every floor.
But like little individual soldiers. And the...
Yeah, those little droids are like, Roger, 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 Roger. And then those battle droids as well, the black rolly ones that are really hard to defeat because they have shields and stuff. So Queen Amidala is fighting her way through these droids and making her way up the stairs through the third floor to the, I forget what it's called, the Emperor's Room or something like that, where the two viceroys are for the Trade Federation.
That's right. And once she gets to them, she can make them surrender.
Right. So each player is basically balancing these 4 different battles. You want to pay attention to all of them, or at the very least, focus on 3 out of 4 of them.
Yeah.
But you can't do everything. And they all sort of enhance the game in a different way. Players' actions are driven by 2 decks of cards for each side. Each deck will focus on the events of 2 of the 4 battles in the game, providing actions that can be performed in one of the pivotal locations of the game. Most cards have 2 different actions on them, but when played, you can do only one of them. So, one deck of cards might have the Trade Federation player deciding between adding more droids to the defense of Theed Palace or using Darth Maul to attack the Jedi. The other deck might have that player deciding to attack one of the Gungan forces with a battle droid or playing cards to slow down Anakin's starfighter.
Okay.
And the Naboo player might have to decide between using Captain Panaka to attack the droids in Theed Palace with a card from one of the deck of cards, and the other deck might have Anakin advancing towards the destruction of the droid control ship or using the Gungan forces to attack the droids on the plains.
Mm-hmm.
Each turn, each player simultaneously chooses 4 action cards from a hand of 10 and places them in front of them in the order that they will be played. Players decide which action on the card is then carried out one at a time, alternating sides between the 2 players. So you might have wanted to do the Jedi battle, but your Jedi were defeated before you got to play that card. So now you're going to
play whatever the other option
do the other part of that card, the opposite. Yeah. So it gives you a bit of choices on your turn as well. But there is this sort of pre-programmed thing.
Okay.
Combat between the Jedi, Darth Maul, the Palace Guards, the droids, and the Gungan forces are all resolved using custom attack and defense dice. Most combat requires line of sight for players to be able to attack each other.
Line of sight in a board game means that players must be able to imagine an invisible straight line, or in some cases using a laser pointer, with no obstructions between the 2 combatants.
In Theed Palace, Queen Amidala even has an identical miniature of Queen Amidala, so that the Trade Federation doesn't ever know which one is the real queen.
Right from the movie.
Yeah, right from the movie. And it's a bit of a bluffing mechanism for the Naboo forces.
Cool.
While Anakin's battle involves rolling specific dice to get through the number of defenses on his way to the droid control ship, the Trade Federation is playing more cards to make that process harder for Anakin. To win, the Naboo player must remove all of the droids from the game, either by slowly destroying them one by one, or having Anakin reach and destroy the droid control ship, and have a majority of miniatures inside the throne room at the top of the 3-level 3D palace.
Okay.
For the Trade Federation to win, they must defeat all but 2 of the Naboo player's miniatures in Theed Palace, thus preventing the Naboo player from ever having majority in the throne room.
So if Anakin makes it to the droid control ship, he can destroy all the droids at once.
All the droids on all the battlefields. So the ones in the palace, the ones on the Gungan fields, everything. He destroys them all.
And if Qui-Gon Jinn or Obi-Wan Kenobi defeat Darth Maul, then they are free to slice up and dice up all the droids, and they can do that very effectively as well.
Yeah, they're pretty powerful.
And so that's why each of these different battlefields is so important,
Yeah.
And you can't ignore any one for too long.
Yeah. And the same is true of Darth Maul. If Darth Maul wins the battle against the two Jedi and defeats both Kenobi and Qui-Gon, he can run in and waste through the palace guards and Queen Amidala, and Panaka and all those guys and help the droids.
Make short work of that.
Exactly. The Gungan and droid battle that's happening on the plains is used primarily to provide reinforcements to the battle that's going on in the palace.
Right.
Now, I like all three of the Star Wars movies. I like all three of them. They're wonderful. But with Star Wars: The Queen's Gambit, arguably one of the worst attempts at a Star Wars movie, becomes one of the best Star Wars board games, in my opinion. Believe me, it is very hard for me to say that about a movie that featured the annoying character of Jar Jar Binks. There is no Jar Jar Binks in Star Wars: The Queen's Gambit.
That's awesome.
But there are 155 plastic miniatures, 3 separate boards, including one of those boards, which is a 3-level 3D palace in the middle of the table.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's such a pretty game as well, right? The components aren't cheap. The plastic corners on all the walls and decent artwork on the boards. And
the models are quite, they're pretty good especially for the time that the game was released. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the Qui-Gon Jinn and the Obi-Wan miniatures could be a little bit more detailed, but
yeah, I always say that this game makes the Phantom Menace movie actually kind of seem a little bit cooler on its own, just because this game exists.
Well, it's because it's the best part of that movie, right? When those 3 battles are happening and we're cutting back and forth.
Right.
And the music's going, wah, 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 wah. I mean, that's decent. That's not a bad, I mean, even the haters like that part.
Yeah, exactly. In the Phantom Menace, Qui-Gon tells us, "Remember, your focus determines your reality." That quote, it's relevant in this game as well, as the tension is very high due to the many battles that you have to focus on. Like we said before, you really have to focus on everything. Mm-hmm. You can't just let one go, because if you do,
that'll be the fatal mistake.
Yeah, your opponent is going to reinforce the palace, or they're going to have one of the Jedi get through, or Darth Maul, or you'll never get to the droid ship, or whatever. You really have to play all sides of the battle. Now, because this is a 2-player episode, I should point out that the game does say it's 2 to 4 players. I mentioned that earlier.
Yeah.
But honestly, it's a 2-player game in that when you play with 4 players, each player just takes control of one of the decks of cards. There's not like a variant rule to play with 4 players. It's exactly the same game, except you control one of the 2 decks and I control one of the 2 decks. And that works fine, actually, in a 4-player. We've played it with 4 and it's okay. Like if you have 4 people who want to play it, it's not a terrible game to play.
It's not unlike Star Wars Rebellion, though, right? That's a similar idea.
Is it?
It's the big epic Star Wars game that really plays better with 2 players, but you can do it 4 players and just give half the cards to your teammate.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah. There's something that seems just it just makes it a little weaker experience, I think, with 4 than it is with 2.
Agreed.
Now, Star Wars: The Queen's Gambit is woefully out of print. It sells for hundreds of dollars online now.
Yeah.
So how I got my copy of Star Wars: The Queen's Gambit is a bit of an interesting story. I'll say a long time ago, back in 2012, I had talked a lot to everyone who would basically listen about how much I loved this game called Star Wars: The Queen's Gambit. And my difficulties in finding a copy to buy even back then. It was long out of print and only available via online marketplaces. At the time, I think they were selling for about $150 to $200, depending on the quality and how much they were used. The price far exceeds that now. At that time, for me at least, that seemed like an outrageous amount of money to spend on a game of any kind. By today's standards, $120 is pretty par for the course.
Yeah, but not that bad.
Back then, Ticket to Ride was selling for $40 brand new on the shelf. So, this was basically buying 3 ticket to rides or 1 game, and it only played 2 players. So I had trouble allowing myself to spend, hard-earned money on a game that cost that much, especially if I could buy 3 or 4 other games for that price. Coming to the rescue, though, was our hockey pool. A bunch of our friends, we got together every year for a friendly wager on who could pick the best players in the NHL playoffs. Everyone puts in $10 and the winner would win the pot. And depending on how many people we had, it could be $100, could be 120, 130.
Nice.
In this particular year, I think it was about $120. That year, my hockey pool team was fantastic.
Nice.
I got lucky and somehow everybody let me pick all the best players. I was outscoring everyone else. I took off with a huge early lead, and victory was not only possible, but it looked probable. It looked like I was going to destroy all my friends in this hockey pool.
That's awesome.
But of course, as always happens in these situations, the playoffs dragged on and more teams and players were eliminated, and I saw my huge lead start to dwindle. My dear friend Les and his team were catching up, and they were catching up really fast. He also happens to be our board game friend who first introduced me to the game Queen's Gambit. We played his copy. So every night we'd get together, we'd play board games with the hockey game playing on the TV in the background. We cheered and booed when our players scored and talked trash about how every night his team was gaining more and more points than mine and how he was getting closer and closer to my team. And if the playoffs would just end soon enough, I would win. In the end, the LA Kings won the Stanley Cup, and my friend Les won our hockey pool in epic fashion. He beat me in the very last game by just 1 point. Victory and my Grail Game were ripped from my grasp. Oh. Swallowing all my joy, I put on a brave face, shook Les's hand, and handed over his winnings, and we even posed for a photo where I pretended to be choking him for stealing my victory. Les interrupted his celebrations to get something that he forgot in his car, and he comes back with a big black plastic bag and hands it to me. And at this point, I think it's something that he created for if and when he'd won the hockey pool, because it was such a dramatic comeback. I figured he's got some sign or something in there.
And he's quite crafty too, so he can make something.
Yeah, he's a very crafty guy. He's a graphic designer. He does, these board game setups that are incredible. Yeah. So I thought it was something that he would just use to rub some salt into my fresh, tender wounds. But, there's something like I would do if I were in his situation. Yeah. Something creatively clever that he's known for. He would make us laugh and maybe make my defeat not hurt quite so much.
Sure.
But inside that black bag was my very own copy of Star Wars: The Queen's Gambit.
Wow.
See, Les, knowing how much I loved the game and how badly I wanted it, he did the research and the work, and he tracked down a copy of the game and bought it to give it to me at the end of the NHL playoffs in our hockey pool, regardless of who won or lost. My uber generous friend Les had decided early on that if he won the pool, he would use the winnings to surprise me and say, "Surprise, you got yourself Queen's Gambit."
Oh my gosh.
And if I won, he would sell it to me for the winnings of the hockey pool. The final round of the playoffs had gone on for so long, he'd been carrying it around in the trunk of his car for days, and coming together every night to play games, waiting for the playoffs to be over so that he could give it to me.
Wow, that's awesome.
Now, I've never won the lottery, but I think I know how it feels. This was a hugely touching, emotional moment for me. This was like I was an audience member that day when Oprah was giving out things on her favorite things episode. You get a new car. You get a Star Wars Queen Gambit. You get a new house. For me, it was Star Wars Queen's Gambit. And I ran around the room hoisting that box over my head like it was the Stanley Cup, cheering and screaming at the top of my lungs at 11 o'clock at night or whatever it was. It was just this magical, special moment that I will never, ever forget.
That's awesome.
I feel so special to have such a wonderful, big-hearted, supportive friends like Les and his wife, Lori, in my life. Not just because they gave me Star Wars Queen's Gambit, but because that experience was so wonderful. And I think all of us that night will remember forever because it was just such a roller coaster of I'm winning, I'm going to win, I'm going to win. Oh no, you caught up. Oh no, I lost. And now I have to shake hands and say, well, maybe next year. And then 2 minutes later, I'm running around the room with my game.
Wow.
That's the story of how I got Star Wars The Queen's Gambit.
That's awesome. Notably absent.
Star Wars Rebellion and Star Realms mentioned in previous episodes.
Blood of an Englishman.
Fox in the Forest.
Blockus Duo.
Hive.
Raptor.
Onitama.
Rivals of Catan.
Magic the Gathering.
Getaway Driver.
Santorini.
Star Wars X-Wing.
Schottentotten, otherwise known as Battle Line.
Android Netrunner.
Twilight Struggle.
Seven Wonders Duel.
Battle Lore.
Memoir 44.
And the Command and Colors series.
Have you played any of the games that we've talked about today? What's your favorite two-player game? Drop us a line at escapeintoboardgames@gmail.com. Thanks for listening to the Escape Into Board Games podcast. Be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at Escape Into Board Games.
This episode is produced by Matt McKenzie and Chris Cormier. Production assistance by Sherry Cormier. Music by John Yasut and Daniel Carlton. See you at the next Escape.